Among the most well-known figures in contemporary Hollywood was Robert Redford. Early this morning, the 89-year-old actor passed away at his Utah home. According to his spokesman, that is, more than just movies are left behind by certain Hollywood icons. They leave behind rivalries, secrets, and tales that endure long after the curtain has fallen. When Robert Redford passed away, the world was shocked, but the rumors that circulated were more loud than the memorials. Beneath his flawless grin and golden exterior was a guy with a history of rivalries that molded his entire career, broken friendships, and unresolved grievances. There is a star who is so strong and memorable, but who is also quite unlikely to pay his final respects to Redford. Even at the very end, what could have kept two Hollywood legends so far apart? Death of Robert Redford. On September 16, 2025, the tragic news of Robert Redford's death spread throughout Hollywood and beyond, causing a great deal of introspection. The man who had been a defining figure in American cinema for almost 60 years was remembered by viewers worldwide. Redford was one of the few performers whose career focused as much on substance as on notoriety. He had won an Oscar, become a box office success, and founded the Sundance Institute, which forever altered the course of independent cinema. However, as the tributes came flooding in, many were compelled to consider the more subdued aspects of his last years and how he had progressively faded from the public eye long before his passing. 2018 marked a sea change when Redford eventually discussed retirement in public. He has made hints for years that he could retire. However, he acknowledged that The Old Man and the Gun would be the last movie he would do as an actor in an interview while it was being promoted. He played an elderly bank robber in the film, who, despite his advanced age, was unable to give up on his passion, and the role turned out to be a surprisingly appropriate metaphor for his own path. At the time, Redford told the Associated Press, "I think it might be time to retire and spend more time with my wife and family now that I'm getting into my 80s. Redford couldn't leave the scene without one more scene, even after the announcement. He reappeared in 2019 for a brief appearance in Avengers Endgame as Alexander Pierce, a character he had created in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Though brief, the appearance was important. Character-driven narratives in difficult dramas had been the foundation of Redford's career, so many were taken aback by his choice to join the Marvel series. He clarified, however, that he was interested in witnessing the new techniques and technology being employed in popular movies. Redford really told the Russo brothers, who directed Endgame, that the day of filming would be his last day of acting ever. That little sequence served as the symbolic end to an incredible film career. Redford's emphasis veered even more away from Hollywood in the ensuing years. After decades of ownership, he sold his horse ranch in Utah in 2020. The sale gave him the opportunity to focus on his Sundance Ranch and his Provo Canyon house, which were essential to who he was outside of acting. Utah was more than just his home state. It was there that he established Sundance as a cultural organization. It has provided the initial chance for many filmmakers. A slower pace and an emphasis on family and the outdoors characterized Robert's last years. He spent a large portion of his time pursuing his lifelong interests in painting, art, and environmental conservation. He stayed close to his children and grandchildren and enjoyed peaceful days with his wife, Sybil Zagers, in a setting that was more focused on nature and art than on Hollywood or celebrity. Redford had given up playing the lead, but he was still involved in narrating stories. In addition to continuing his work as a producer behind the scenes, he was a key player in the 2022 premiere of the AMC series Dark Winds. He appeared briefly on screen in the second season of the show in 2025, playing a quiet part that was significant due to its rarity. His last performance was that one. His tranquil death at his Sundance home marked the end of a life that he had lived according to his own wishes. The subsequent tributes demonstrated the extent of his impact. Producers, filmmakers, and actors credited Sundance with helping them launch their careers, and fans recalled the memorable characters he created. But despite all of the positive feedback, Redford's death also highlighted his contentious past. This frequently caused strife in Hollywood. Although Redford had collaborated with many of the most well-known figures in the field, he also had disagreements with some of them. Additionally, these disputes have influenced conjecture regarding who might or might not attend his burial. On the surface, Redford's latter years may have appeared serene, but in reality, his life had always been molded by intense internal conflict. He suffered from disease, bereavement, and grief long before the world hailed him as a cinematic star. Events that shaped his decisions both behind the camera and off. A life filled with hardships. Robert Redford's troubles started when he was young and was told he had a slight case of polio, which at the time terrified parents all over America. The incident made him face weakness at an early age, even if his condition was not as bad as many others, and he finally healed. He was also left feeling more vulnerable than most kids his age would ever have to consider. Throughout his life, he would subtly carry with him this early realization of how easily stability and health could vanish. When he reached adolescence, the agony of childhood illness was followed by something far more horrific. Redford was just 18 when his mother, Martha, passed away in 1955 as a result of problems after childbirth. He was rattled in ways that stayed with him after losing a parent at such a critical juncture. And the most agonizing thing that happened to him as a young man was her death. He had to live with a persistent sensation of absence as he approached adulthood as a result of the loss. Additionally, it made him confront feelings and obligations that most young men his age were unprepared to deal with. The trauma of losing her also made him more reflective, which people would later notice since it made him more serious even though he was portrayed as a golden boy on TV. In Van Nuys, California, Redford's family life got more complex with the death of his mother. Despite the fact that he was surrounded by others throughout his working-class upbringing, he frequently felt alone. He later acknowledged that, as a young man, he preferred to be alone with his thoughts over being in big gatherings. And that feeling of alienation throughout his early years. Tragic events nearly immediately followed his 1958 marriage to historian Lola Van Wagenen, which seemed to usher in a new and better chapter in his life. At just 10 weeks old, their first son, Scott, passed away from SIDS. Although Redford rarely discussed the loss in interviews, the young couple was crushed by it, and the pain never really went away. His loss of Scott deepened his understanding of family life and fragility. It further solidified his resolve to keep his values safe from public interference. The three further children that Robert and Lola had were Shauna, James, and Amy. Additionally, their marriage served as a basis for him to build his career for many years. But decades later, the weight of his early tragedies was echoed by the specter of loss. For the most of his life, James, his son, struggled with severe health issues and had to undergo 2 transplants to survive due to a rare liver ailment. Despite his sickness, James established a successful career for himself as an activist and filmmaker, frequently working on projects that mirrored his interests in social justice and the environment. However, James tragically died of bile duct carcinoma in 2020 at the age of 58. This disease was a consequence of his previous health issues. Redford publicly acknowledged that he was devastated, and he was 84 when it occurred. Losing 2 children at various times in life was a burden that even a man of Redford's fortitude could not bear, but losing one child is a sorrow that never goes away. However, Redford's personal struggles were not limited to these catastrophes. He had been married to Lola for almost 30 years before they were divorced in 1985. Redford never stoked rumors about why they had split up. Reluctant to let other people enjoy his private life. His silence on the subject confirmed his lifetime practice of keeping his private life private, since he believed the facts were not for the general public to know. He finally discovered friendship again after living alone for a long time. In 2009, he married German artist Sibyl Zagers. He created a later life with her that was focused on privacy, art, and nature, far from the field that had shaped his career. In contrast to many celebrities of his period, Redford was not interested in making his family life public in order to garner sympathy or attention. He understood that the best way to protect himself and his loved ones was to hide that aspect of his life from the cameras since he had witnessed far too much tragedy. Redford was never a part of the Hollywood system. He enjoyed taking his own approach and never altered who he was to appease the industry. But even though this led to admiration for him, it also caused conflict and strained certain relationships. Hollywood against Redford. Even though Robert Redford was one of the most well-known performers in the world, he never felt completely at ease using the Hollywood apparatus. He had been uncomfortable with the studio system's workings since the beginning of his career, and he never held back from voicing his disapproval. He frequently expressed how much he detested studio politics. The never-ending red tape that seems to accompany every effort. In contrast to many performers who learned to work inside the system by being silent or making concessions to executives, Redford frequently took the more difficult route, demanding creative independence even when it led to conflict. In 1974, The Great Gatsby was one of the first and most well-known instances of this. While the movie had all the makings of a huge hit, a well-loved novel, an A-list cast, and a large studio behind it, Redford was dissatisfied with the script and the casting choices that were made for him. Redford was cast as Jay Gatsby. He expressed how frustrated he was with the direction the movie was going. He ultimately declined to go to the premiere, which was quite unusual for a celebrity of his caliber at the time and demonstrated just how far he was prepared to go in order to uphold his convictions. A lot of his interactions with Hollywood were characterized by this mindset. He often fought with executives over creative freedom, leaving movies when he didn't think the projects were being managed in a way he could approve of. He allegedly left a film called Blue at the last minute, for instance, leaving the studio in a bind. He was already cast as the lead, as in Indecent Proposal, but he almost left the movie because he didn't agree with the way the plot was being developed. Studio executives began to question Redford's reputation. Audiences adored him and he was bankable, but when it comes to actually completing tasks, he was unpredictable. Hollywood executives and co-workers frequently grumbled about another habit of his that annoyed them. He has a reputation for being late or even missing meetings completely. Redford's skill, popularity at the box office, and increasing impact as a filmmaker and activist made him hard to ignore, even though this might have hurt the careers of many actors. Despite the fact that he wasn't the most easy star to work with, he had gained enough credibility and authority that he could afford to take chances with his career. However, Redford did not consider this behavior to be rebellion in and of itself. He really didn't appreciate how Hollywood controlled creative and focused on money. And he thought that filmmakers required a different setting where they could make their work how they wanted. As a result of that conviction, he founded the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, two of his most significant contributions to the industry. For independent filmmakers who were having difficulty making a name for themselves in a major studio-dominated business, Redford envisioned Sundance as a sanctuary. He provided budding filmmakers and authors with the means to share their stories without diluting them for profit. It is impossible to exaggerate Sundance's impact. The festival served as a springboard for the careers of directors like Ryan Coogler, Chloe Zhao, Quentin Tarantino, and innumerable others who would go on to change Hollywood. Sundance was more than just a film festival for Redford. It directly opposed the commercialism of Hollywood. It was an example of the kind of film he supported. One that allowed fresh perspectives and daring concepts to take precedence over safe, dependable hits. Redford's independence extended beyond his work in cinema. Additionally, he spoke out on social and political concerns at a period when many celebrities were afraid to offend fans. Using his notoriety, he promoted causes related to the queer community, Native American rights, and the environment, frequently incorporating these ideas into the initiatives he funded. His personal views on challenging authority and making powerful institutions accountable were reflected in films such as The Candidate and All the President's Men, which were also engaging political dramas. Redford did not see art as distinct from activism. They had a connection, and he highlighted subjects close to his heart by using Hollywood's influence. Naturally, he wasn't always liked for his candidness and defiance of Hollywood conventions. Throughout his career, he was rumored to have declined to collaborate with specific actors or directors following personal or professional disputes. In keeping with his personality, he never publicly discussed these disagreements. Silence, in his opinion, was more potent than conflict. He therefore refrained from making his disputes into news stories, even though he had strong feelings about those with whom he disagreed. Because his co-workers were never exactly sure what he was thinking, this made him both mysterious and admired. However, if they had collaborated and failed to gain his trust, they were aware of their position with him. Both his greatest accomplishments and his most tense relationships were brought on by his individualism and persistent defiance of Hollywood convention. There were others who found him challenging, unyielding, or even conceited, for every admirer who respected him for remaining loyal to himself. Redford was not contributing, though. He conducted his private life and career in the same manner, by establishing clear limits and upholding his morals unconditionally. There were also other professional relationships that ended so openly that it was hard to ignore, even though Redford rarely mentioned specific persons when discussing his difficulties. One in particular concerned one of the most significant screenwriters of the 20th century, whose remarks had influenced Redford's early career. However, their divorce demonstrated that ego, control, and Hollywood politics could still exert a strong hold on even brilliant pairings. The controversy surrounding William Goldman. When discussing Robert Redford's career, it is impossible to overlook the influence screenwriter William Goldman had on it. One of Hollywood's most renowned writers, Goldman's screenplays helped define whole cinematic periods. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were the brainchild of this man. In addition to giving Redford his breakthrough performance, the film permanently linked his name to the Sundance persona. A reputation as one of the most incisive and impactful writers the business had ever seen, Goldman would go on to compose a number of other successful works and win 2 Academy Awards for screenplay in the process. The early partnership between Redford and Goldman appeared to be a match made in heaven. Goldman offered a compelling narrative structure and clever wordplay. Redford, on the other hand, contributed charisma, star power, and a keen understanding of how characters ought to be shown on screen. Together, they produced iconic moments in cinematic history. However, beneath the success lay a creative rift that would later become one of Redford's most agonizing career splits. The pivotal moment occurred during the production of All the President's Men, the 1976 motion picture version of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's Watergate investigation. Redford had a strong commitment to this endeavor. The book's rights had been purchased by him. In addition to acting as Woodward, he was producing the movie. He saw this as more than just another film. It was a declaration about power, truth, and journalism. He wanted everything to be perfect because of this, including the screenplay and the performances. It seemed like a wonderful fit on paper when William Goldman was hired to write the screenplay. Goldman, who had just won an Oscar for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was renowned for his ability to transform challenging subjects into gripping drama. However, as the filming progressed, Redford and director Alan Pakula were more and more irritated with Goldman's drafts. The story required the raw depth of investigative reporting, which they felt the script lacked and was overly stylized. In the end, Redford and Pakula reportedly rewrote a significant portion of the movie themselves. Only around 10% of Goldman's original script remained. Redford's public declaration struck Goldman hard. It felt like a betrayal to a writer who took great pleasure in his work and who had already made significant contributions to Redford's career to learn that his work had been reduced to nearly nothing. Goldman was upset that Redford would limit his role so much and maintained that the core of the movie was still his work even after changes were made. For All the President's Men, Goldman won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay in spite of the conflict. But it was a complicated triumph. There were a lot of questions in the business behind the scenes about how much of the finished movie actually originated from Goldman's pen. After looking into the situation and analyzing drafts and changes, the Writers Guild of America decided that Goldman should be given credit as the screenplay's only author. In spite of what Redford and Pakula had asserted, it was a formal recognition that Goldman's work was still essential to the movie. Goldman's scars from the incident never completely went away. Redford, he believed, had attempted to minimize his contribution to one of the most significant undertakings of his career, and their once promising creative collaboration had fallen apart due to control and ego. In public, the two men never made up. And even though they continued working together on other projects, their partnership essentially came to an end there. Goldman had put his heart into the writing, and he carried the grudge for years, while Redford, who valued loyalty and long-term partnerships, appeared to tolerate the distance. Looking back on the show, many fans still speculate about what would have happened if Redford and Goldman had been able to maintain their professional relationship. Would they have been able to produce more films together that were on par with Butch Cassidy and All of the President's Men? Or, considering Redford's insistence on ensuring that his projects were just what he had in mind, was the rupture inevitable? Goldman himself bore his disappointment in a calm but forceful manner, leaving the wound unhealed, and Redford never talked about Goldman in detail after their breakup. Hollywood has many of failed collaborations, but this one was particularly noteworthy because it involved two people who had previously influenced one another's work. Their disagreements ended one of Redford's most significant creative partnerships and once again exposed the complexity of his relationship with Hollywood. But that wouldn't be the last time Redford did not get along with another industry titan. Next in line to Redford's stubborn streak would be William Goldman, another actor with equal strength, impact, and a similarly unwavering sense of pride. Redford Roberts vs. Nicholson Jack. It is nearly impossible to avoid comparisons and rivalries when two of Hollywood's top names emerge simultaneously. The 1930s saw the birth of both Jack Nicholson and Robert Redford. Both rose to prominence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Additionally, both ended up representing quite different facets of American film. Redford was the well-groomed, attractive, blonde golden boy who was frequently portrayed as the epitome of the American hero. In almost every character, Nicholson conveyed grit and unpredictableness, while bringing a darker, more rebellious energy. They were rarely seen as friends, and despite the fact that they never publicly quarreled, Hollywood insiders frequently discussed their covert competition. There were several pivotal instances, particularly in relation to The Great Gatsby, where the two men's differences were shown. When Paramount Pictures was creating The Great Gatsby in the early 1970s, several well-known names were proposed for the lead part. Among them was Jack Nicholson's name. Being Jay Gatsby was one of the most sought-after roles of the decade and an opportunity to play one of the most recognizable figures in literature. Robert Redford, who was soaring on the popularity of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was ultimately cast in the part. The casting, however, did not persuade Nicholson. He allegedly thought Redford's image was too pristine and affluent. It was too polished to represent the ambitious, tormented driver that F. In the book that Scott Fitzgerald had written. In his opinion, Gatsby was a man who bore the scars of hardship and desperation. He amassed a fortune not because he was privileged but rather because he had a restless ambition to rise. Redford was unable to convey that character's rawness, but Nicholson thought he could. It was no secret that Nicholson was hesitant to cast Redford in the part. Redford, he would later say, appeared to be a privileged individual. Gatsby would not be concerned about hacking his way up as a persona, he added. Redford didn't have the edge, the hunger, or the tumultuous past that Nicholson believed characterized Gatsby's essence. Redford's talent was not disparaged, rather, it was a direct statement of how differently the two men viewed the same character. There was an impact from Nicholson's remarks. Redford had always been cautious with his press appearance, picking his comments carefully and steering clear of needless controversy. Nicholson, however, was frequently unvarnished and more straightforward. Nicholson's doubts about Redford's appropriateness for Gatsby not only documented their disagreements in public but also strengthened the idea that the two performers had a distrustful relationship. Since Nicholson never portrayed Gatsby, his suspicion that he could have given the character more nuance was never put to the test. However, the concept continued to be discussed in Hollywood. The Great Gatsby, starring Redford, was not the box office hit the studio had planned for in 1974. Critics gave the picture mixed reviews, frequently criticizing its lack of emotional depth and polished exterior. Nicholson seemed to have foreseen the reasons why the movie would falter in his remarks. However, Redford and Nicholson were circling the same roles elsewhere besides the Gatsby moment. In The Godfather, both were once considered for the role of Michael Corleone. Ultimately, the part went to Al Pacino, whose intense brooding style changed the expectations of viewers for a mafia tale. The Sting, one of Redford's most cherished pictures from 1973, served as another example. Nicholson was offered the part of Johnny Hooker, the story's teenage con artist who co-stars with Paul Newman's character. Nevertheless, Nicholson declined it, deciding instead to concentrate on initiatives that he felt offered greater intricacy, such as Chinatown. Nicholson gave one of the most acclaimed performances of the decade in Chinatown, and Redford got one of his biggest hits, so the choice paid out for both men. However, whether they acknowledged it or not, the overlap strengthened the impression that they were frequently working in the same field, selecting from the same pool of well-known scripts, and comparing themselves to one another. Nevertheless, Redford and Nicholson never collaborated on a movie. This is a strong statement for two celebrities of their caliber. In order to increase box office revenue or to create tension on screen, Hollywood frequently couples opposing stars, yet this never happened in this instance. Theories about why differ. According to some, Nicholson saw little benefit in collaborating with Redford, while others contend that Redford wanted to maintain strict control over his projects and might not have wanted to share the limelight with someone as dominant as Nicholson. His relationship with Nicholson never descended into outright animosity, unlike Redford's spat with William Goldman, but the tension was there, woven into Nicholson's remarks, the roles they shared, and the professional quiet that separated them. This competition mainly stayed hidden from viewers. Only the occasional quotation or hypothetical situation involving the roles they both could have performed makes this apparent. However, it further damaged Redford's relationship with Hollywood. He was a man to be admired but also questioned. Although he had aptitude, he occasionally exhibited too much control, polish, and caution. Do you believe Robert Redford had a falling out with another actor? Tell us by leaving a comment below. Please remember to click like on the next video that appears on your screen and subscribe to our channel for future updates if you like this one.